Holy City Center Radio is episode 349, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Friday, March 7th, 2025. Welcome back to the show, and I hope you have an amazing weekend ahead. If you need plans, holycitycenter.com/calendar is the place to go. You can find all sorts of things going on, not just this weekend, but beyond. And yes, thank you again for coming back and listening to the show. I greatly appreciate it. Some really awesome episodes earlier this week. On Monday and Wednesday, both shows were interviews. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. The first one, very informative, getting lots of good feedback on it as it relates to a state Senate bill and tort reform, which is involving insurance companies, not just in the restaurant industry, even though that's what everyone has been kind of told this is what the bill is about. But it's also going to, would affect, if it goes through, especially as written currently, would affect a lot as it has to do with insurance, who is reliable or who can be found liable for all sorts of different things. And again, not just in the food and beverage industry, but also in cases involving hospitals and things like that. So if you missed it, definitely go back and listen to that one. If you're looking for something a little bit more lighter, a little bit more fun, that would have been Wednesday's episode with TD McMurray, who owns a store that bears his name, a men's clothing store in Mount Pleasant. So something, if you're not wanting to do the whole politics and, thing, I get it. Granted, it's different than normal politics we're talking about on the national level, but that's a little bit more fun, a little bit more light. And today, I'm going to get you caught up on everything that you have missed, and at least some of those things, because there is so much going on nationally, of course, but also on the local level. So I'm going to just kind of get you with some of the bigger stories, most of which are updates to things we've talked about previously. And then hopefully we come, on Monday's episode, I'll be able to finish it all up. But without any further delay, let's get into the news. So it's been about a week or so after federal corruption charges were announced against 3 council members in North Charleston, and now we know at least some of those seats are going to have an election coming up in just a little bit. Specifically, a special election has been set for May 27th to fill the vacant seats, but it will not be for every one of those seats. I'll explain why in a moment. First, the details for anyone who's interested in running. Filing for the single-member district seats will run from March 14th to March 24th at noon, so you would have until then to file to run. The election that falls the day after Memorial Day will only include Districts 3 and 5. The 2 districts are on they're basically opposite ends of the city. District 3 is in the northern part of North Charleston between Rivers Avenue and I-26, while District 5 is between the Ashley River and Dorchester Road in the southern part of the city. Former council members Sandino Moses and Jerome Hayward both entered guilty pleas on February 28th. Hayward, he was the representative for District 5. He was facing charges that range from bribery and wire fraud to money laundering. Meanwhile, Moses, who represented District 3, was charged for allegedly failing to alert authorities of the attempted bribe to influence his city council vote. They both resigned from their seats and then ultimately had their plea hearings where they decided to plead guilty. Meanwhile, Mike Brown, who is the District 1 councilman, and remember there's 2 Mike Browns, so we're talking about the one in District 1, he was charged with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit bribery regarding programs receiving federal funds. He is set to be arraigned on March 11th, so just a few days away. Governor McMaster, because Brown didn't resign, he had the authority to suspend him, and that's exactly what he did. But because he didn't resign, it means his seat will just sit there and remain unrepresented until he's either acquitted or convicted. So there could have been all seats just sitting there affecting, all sorts of things, votes that they wouldn't be able to take part in. Of course, they couldn't do anything. And so they would just have 3 empty seats. So the good news here is that there's just going to be 1 empty seat for a little while. And then, depending on the outcome of his case, that'll determine, if he remains in his seat, or I should say his suspension ends and he can go back. Or once he's convicted, he can actually be removed from that seat and then we'll be facing another special election. If you're wondering, the special election will cost the city about $40,000. This is according to the executive director of the Charleston County Board of Voter Registration and Elections. So, we were all kind of wondering, okay, what exactly does this all mean? When will there be an election? What do we have to wait for? And now we have some of those details. Like I said, thankfully, 2 members resigned, and that means that those seats can be filled, just here in a couple months. Meanwhile, that other one is just going to be sitting there for District 1 until Mike Brown's case, ultimately ends in whichever direction that goes. If anything changes, of course, I'll pass along that information. But that is the latest update in regards to that corruption scandal going on in North Charleston. We told you that the 6-week abortion ban that South Carolina passed, which might as well be a total abortion ban, and I've discussed that numerous times in this podcast, myself and many others said they're not going to stop there. Yes, they put something in place that is more draconian, than many other states, and obviously was different than Roe v. Wade, but it wasn't what a lot of people on the far right wanted. They wanted a complete ban, period, end of sentence, and that means no exceptions for rape or incest. And despite the fact that they couldn't get enough people to sign on for that, and they settled for that 6-week ban instead, which does include some exceptions. They're back, and look, it may not pass, but it's got more support than you would hope that it did. And so, yes, there is a new piece of legislation going through that they, if enacted, would ban all abortions immediately after conception. There would be no exception for rape or incest. And at this point, the Post and Courier is reporting, based on their sources and people they've talked to in the State House, that 1/3 of the Republicans in the South Carolina House of Representatives currently support it. Now, obviously, Republicans they have a supermajority in the House and the Senate. They can kind of do whatever they want, but there are some Republicans, as you just heard, 2/3 have either not given their opinion yet, they haven't made a decision, or they have, and they're just not telling anybody. But some other bad signs are that, number one, despite there seeming to be some divisions within the party as it relates to this abortion ban, there is some chatter that although they can solidly say 1/3 of Republicans in the House are on board, they actually believe it's more than that, because people just aren't expressing that they're going to vote for it. In addition to that, some other bad signs are that some of the more powerful people in the House do support it. That includes Speaker of the House Merle Smith, a Republican from Sumter, and the Majority Leader Davey Hyatt, a Republican, of course, from Pickens. They both have signed on to the legislation, along with 37 others in support. Now, like I said, they do believe they have some encouraging responses off the record that they, are going to get plenty more votes for this. So that's the bad news. The good news is that's just chatter. Until a vote happens, we don't really know. Things could change, and a big possibility for change is contacting your representative. Now, some of us, that might not be an option. Our representative may be a Democrat, and we know they're going to vote against it. But if you live somewhere with a Republican representative, this is a chance for you to contact them and sway them on this bill. If they're on the fence, or even like leaning towards, yeah, I'll vote for it, if they get enough pushback from their constituents, there is a chance that they won't go forward with it. So that's going to be the key here, is how many people are going to contact their representatives and push them in whichever direction. So I encourage you to do so if you haven't already. Now, say that it somehow does go through in the House, the Senate would still have to pass it. The House tends to be a little bit more conservative, a little bit more far right, in terms of at least that they're willing to put their names to legislation like this, whereas even if they think, hey, you know what, I kind of believe there should be a complete ban, I know it won't look good for me politically because my constituents are, they're not as far right or whatever it may be. So there's always that chance that the Senate will either, slam it down and that's the end of it, or they might pass a different version with some changes, and then the House would have to go back and approve them. So there's a long way to go, but they're trying again. And that's another worrisome thing for anybody listening who doesn't believe that this should pass. So be sure to contact your representative, tell them you do not want a total abortion ban. We've already seen, not just in this state, but in others, the fallout that has come from these types of legislations with very draconian views and beliefs and laws. I should say beliefs that they've turned into laws based on their own, religion. And that's not how you should be voting on laws. But in any event, they're going to keep trying. And the fallout, like I said, has already been bad. We've heard stories, I'm sure you've read them, about people who, have had to sit and wait in hospitals, basically suffering. There's a woman I think I talked about in this podcast. Maybe I didn't, but it was a somewhat viral video on TikTok of a woman in another part of a state who said she had an ectopic pregnancy, but they wouldn't, abort because her life wasn't in danger, and that's really the only exception. And she was past the 6-week mark. Those types of pregnancies are not viable. There is no reason to make someone wait, but because of the way the law is written by people who are not doctors and don't understand medicine, there are people in those types of situations, people who have to basically wait until their life is actually on the line until an abortion can be done. Those are the types of changes they should be making to the current legislation, is making things clearer and carving out more clear exceptions when there is no reason to make someone wait. But of course, no, forget that. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to ban them all together. But again, even if they pass that, there has to be some sort of exception for pregnancies that are not viable, that are going to end in the same way, and except you're just going to make someone wait, dragging out their pain and possibly heartbreak if there's someone who wants a child, but just they were told they have a pregnancy that is not viable. I mean, it's just horrific what people may have to go through, and this isn't going to help that, of course. And it's just unbelievable that they would force people who are victims of rape or incest to carry a child or children to term just because that's what this law would do. And it's just unthinkable that that's the direction people want to bring us into. So, again, be sure to contact your representatives. There is no sign that this is going to go away. If it is roundly and soundly defeated in a state that is this red, perhaps they'll take a step back and at least rethink their position. I'm sure they'll come back with some other piece of legislation, but maybe they'll, be a little bit, they'll have a little bit more leniency about some things. So very important to make your voice heard. Please do so. An update on the next man scheduled to die by execution here in the state of South Carolina. The state Supreme Court rejected what is probably going to be the final appeal of condemned man Brad Sigmund, which means that today, Friday, he will die by firing squad. Yes, if you remember, that is what he ultimately chose, deciding that, okay, the electric chair sounds barbaric. We'll get to why they were not so keen on lethal injection, and just figured, this is not a way that they would want to choose, but they felt this was their best option. So Sigmund's lawyers wanted to delay his death so that they could get a fuller hearing in court to learn more information about the drug that South Carolina uses in lethal injections. Sigmund, through his attorney, said the lack of information forced him to choose to be shot to death. The state, as I mentioned, has the electric chair, but Sigmund said he didn't want to suffer being cooked alive by electricity, as his lawyers put it. His attorneys also argued that his original lawyers back in 2002 at his trial where he was convicted did a poor job of trying to save his life after he pled guilty, but they apparently did not submit enough evidence of his mental problems. They alleged he had some childhood trauma, including, unfortunately, some instances of perhaps physical abuse at the hand of his father, which also could have affected his brain makeup, and could have led to injuries that have affected the way he thinks and acts. And they've said that's led to, some sort of emotional disorder amongst other ailments that they felt should have been brought to the court's attention. Now, we've talked about this before. It's hard to find sympathy for people, and I'm going to tell you what his crime is that he was convicted of. because there's that side of things. I mean, this guy did not do a good thing. This is a bad person, at least based on this one action, of course. He's currently 67 years old, but he's been convicted of a crime where he beat his ex-girlfriend's parents to death with a baseball bat in their Greenville County home. His plan was to kidnap his ex-girlfriend, spend a romantic weekend together, and then kill her and himself. She thankfully escaped from his car as he drove away. So, yeah, this is not a good crime. I don't want that to be lost here, that this, is some innocent man. Now, if there was some mental disorders, if he was incompetent to stand trial, sure, that should have been brought up. But it appears that the state Supreme Court decided, nope, everything was done appropriately. This is moving forward. So he will be, unless there is something that unforeseen happening, will be strapped into a chair today at 6 p.m. He'll be in what's called the death chamber that's used for all South Carolina executions at the Broad River Correctional Institute in Columbia. A target will be placed over his heart and a hood over his head. 3 shooters, all with live ammunition, will fire from 15 feet away. When it's over, Sigmund would be the first inmate killed by a firing squad in the U.S. in 15 years and the first in this state ever. The reason I describe what's going to happen, I think a lot of people sort of get what happens with the electric chair and get what happens with lethal injection, but when have we ever really dealt with firing? It's been 15 years since this country has done it, period. So a lot of people don't quite get or understand how it works. So that's why I described it. I'm sorry, this story between this and his crime, it's some brutal things to think about, of course. But this is what we're dealing with when it comes to the death penalty and why it's so complicated in terms of, that's a pretty bad crime. And assuming, he had a fair trial and all that, it certainly seems like a person who would be a candidate for execution. But there's some of us who don't believe we should be executing people, no matter how horrible they are. But I certainly get the feeling, certainly that you believe that I certainly do understand, I should say, how someone would think, no, this is the type of person who should be executed for pretty horrific and terrible crimes. So lawyers for Sigmund said in court papers that he chose this violent death because without more information, he thought he would die a torturous death if he picked lethal injection. Now, they're basing this on autopsies from 2 inmates that were executed in the months since South Carolina got back in the business of killing people, when they were able to add lethal injection as an option again. We've talked about that before, but in any event, in these autopsies that showed that the inmates had massive amounts of pentobarbital, and it showed a considerable amount of fluid in their lungs, which they said a defense expert testified the inmates could have suffered a lot while struggling to breathe. Essentially, he painted this horrible picture that they drowned to death. However, lawyers for the state have said fluid is often found in the lungs of prisoners killed by lethal injections, and other courts have not ruled it as cruel and unusual punishment. They also said witnesses at the executions, including the inmates' attorneys, did not report any breathing or signs of consciousness after about a minute. So basically, they're arguing like maybe there's fluid in the lungs, but other courts have said, no, this is not cruel and unusual punishment, and that no one was seeing any visual signs that they were struggling to breathe or choking or anything like that. So basically alleging that they're not feeling what's happening to them after a certain amount of time. So again, barring anything unforeseen, the execution will go through around 6 p.m. tonight. Of course, if there's any updates, I'll let you know on Monday's podcast. Yeah, now realizing this is a tough episode. I've already talked about the accusations Representative Nancy Mace has made. I talked about them in detail in at least 2 different podcasts, so I'm not going to dive into those details in this story. But keep in mind that even so, this case involves accusations of physical and sexual violence, and if that's not something even tangentially you want to hear about, fast forward. I totally understand. One of the men that Representative Nancy Mace accused of being a predator in a nearly hour-long speech on the U.S. House floor a few weeks back, is vehemently denying her allegations. That man's name is Brian Musgrave, and through his attorney, Eric Bland, sent an open letter to Mace and members of the media last Thursday, demanding that Mace either show evidence to back up her allegations, retract her claims, and issue an apology, or prepare for the matter to move forward in court. In Musgrave's open letter to Mace, his lawyer Bland said the only connection that Musgrave had with Mace's allegations is that he owned an interest in the beach condo where Mace claims some of these assaults took place. Musgrave also owns the condo with Bryant, who Bland describes as his lifelong friend. Bryant, by the way, Patrick Bryant, is Nancy Mace's ex-fiance, who was also accused of all manner of crimes by Mace. And he is the only one that has any sort of, at least any sort of case that officials have acknowledged is being looked at. The other men mentioned, so far there's been no police reports on any level involving them. But because they're coming out with statements and defending themselves, and most importantly, because Nancy Mace named them on the House floor, all of them have released some sort of statement. But this is the most forceful one we've seen yet, where an attorney, with the client, but through the attorney, of course, is basically saying, hey, we deny these accusations. If they're true about my client, show us the proof, but we'll also accept an apology and you withdrawing your accusations against him. Otherwise, they're going to move forward. Now, what will that mean? We'll see, because there's questions of, was her speech protected because she was on the House floor? It usually is. But then, she talked about it online later, and she had the poster with the men's pictures that she had on the House floor. She had that posted outside her office for, several days after everything took place. So a lot of questions. It'll be interesting to see what happens. So far, this was over a week ago. There's been no response, at least publicly, from Mace or any attorneys that may be representing her. So we'll see what ultimately ends up happening. But for now, that is the latest update on that situation. And of course, this is big news. Whatever ends up happening, because either these things are true or partially true, and these are horrible crimes that people should be held accountable for, or maybe it's not so true, and that would also be a big story. So I'll let you know if anything happens here on this podcast. And that'll do it for this edition of Holy City Center Radio. Sorry for a bummer of an episode, corruption, and everything else. I don't need to get back into it. So let's go have a good weekend. Let's try not to pay attention to the news, whether it's nationally or locally. Have a good time this weekend. I'll be back with you on Monday. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Lindsay Marie Collins with LMC Soundsystem for producing this and every episode of Holy City Center Radio. And thank you to Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every show. Again, have an amazing weekend. I can't wait to be back with you next week. But until then, good night and good luck.